Welcome to Beyond the Spire, a podcast of the Save Our Sacred Sons project here in Preston at the Catholic Shrine of St. Walburg, supported by the National Lottery. In each episode, we go beyond what you see from the street. We explore the story and the sound of Gregorian chant, the Church's own voice, so that this treasure of faith and culture is not just preserved, but lived and loved again. I am Canon Bunans. Whether you're a musician, a member of a parish choir, or simply someone curious about the Catholic faith heritage, you came to the right place. Let's begin. In today's episode, I am very pleased to welcome Lois Kay from County of Songs.
Hello. So great to be here with you. So I'm Loz Kay. I'm director of County of Song, which is a project which supports community singing across Lancashire. My background is as a composer, as a musical director and choir leader. So that's very much my perspective on what we're going to be talking about today. I'm very passionate about the power of the human voice to communicate.
It's impressive because, we talk about Gregorian chant in all these episodes, but we haven't talked about choir leading. And as we need to talk about the shift between Gregorian chant and polyphonical works, I think you're the right person to have here.
Lovely.
Can you tell us about Gregorian chant, your experience?
Well, in particular, I became fascinated with Gregorian chant's role in our shared heritage when I was starting to teach music history, which was actually at an academy in Denmark. I think what's fascinating, I was tasked with teaching kind of history of Western music, and essentially you're kind of left with the question about, well, where do you start? What is your first lesson, and where does it begin? And the really obvious answer is Gregorian chant, not least because that's an onward and clear heritage which is continuously communicated, but also it's very much the beginning point of how music is articulated and how singing is articulated, and heritages that and a vast number of heritages that we still share today, but that beginning with the sense of a line, but a line that can communicate to us emotionally, that can communicate to us spiritually.
Well, Gregorian chant is obviously a line, a melody. So polyphonical works were beginning as the music started to be written. And it was each voice on one sheet, just one line on every sheet, and then put them all together as a stack, maybe. And this is how we are used today to have those stacked staves for reading. But yes, there is a whole development here from the single line, the melody, the unique melody of Gregorian chant, and then all these harmonical journeys that we have in polyphonical works.
Yeah, well, this was a really significant development. I think what one can trace is also is the beginning of the kind of the role of the composer, and that had already started with composers like Hildegard of Bingen, sort of at the end of 11th century. So, but she's working with one line. But something like O Euchari, you can absolutely see almost the personality of a composer. It opens with this going E, B, and top E. There's a fifth and a fourth. There's a decisive musical gesture there, and that's about how we communicate, the sense of communicating something to both those taking part in singing, but also listening. Um, but I think the really significant moment is the shift in notation from being something was essentially as an aid to memory, that there was the chant being essentially an oral tradition, but also as a body of work that that you need to be able to remember what you're doing. But a shift from that notation to being that aid to memory to something which also an individual composer or an individual choir leader could work with. So starting off, we see a development of kind of organum where we've got parts working in parallel, but not true polyphony in the sense that we would understand it of voices working on top of each other, or across each other. But then we're seeing with kind of Leonon and Periton that a kind of that notation makes something possible, which is also more complex structures. So so there are the fluid voices that go over longer held notes. So this kind of shift to making structure, which is very much, in a way, sets the scene for everything that happens within Western classical music, because so much of Western classical music is about structure, how we organize the music, but also to find a different expressive possibility. But as you said, you can see that there's this gradual transition, because now we're very used to, I find it, as a choir leader, I find it quite hard to imagine how you would work with people just with their own one part by themselves. But that's still showing that the line is what's leading, rather than a sense of a vertical whole, which is what we come to next, with a sense of harmony being a leading force within what is expressive within vocal music.
And is harmony, in your opinion, the major thing different from Gregorian chant that leads all the choirs to sing that new way of making music?
Well, yes, it is, because it's also a fundamental shift about how we perceive music. So I'm talking about the line, which is, I mean, very literally horizontal when it's written out, to a sense of vertical, which is with harmony, and particularly in terms of how Western harmony develops, with the sense of chords that is also built up on this idea of the triads, that you need a vertical texture to be able to have harmony itself. And again, this is already implicit within what, say, Periton's doing, that you're starting to develop more part voices. But then as we're coming in, towards something like kind of later on Monteverdi, that we're seeing the classification of harmony as a kind of leading idea, but also significantly as a force of communication and a way to move both the listener and the performer. And I'm going to just grab I've got my big book of history of music here. There was how old this idea is, that there's writer called Zarlino, writing in 1558. It's about also already in that point in the 16th century, we've got ideas about how how you write harmony to suit words. So the Zarlino writes, when a composer wishes to express harshness, bitterness, and similar things, he will do best to arrange the parts of the composition so they proceed with movements that are without the semitones, such as those of the whole tone and the ditone. So again, that's technical, but what I think's fascinating is that we haven't, in that 16th century point, we're already having ideas of how you use harmony to communicate, rather than how you shape the line, as how Hildegard of Bingen did.
And when we mix the both methods, vertical, harmonical, and line melody, you have the famous counterpoint, which is so amazing to sing, because you are addressing a question to someone who answers you, but you still have to move all together, and sometimes you rest while it's like a game.
Yes, well, I think because what starts to happen is, because of that, of what I referred to as that innovation of also composers and writers becoming interested in structure, but also the possibility to manipulate music on the page, is also how it starts to become possible to work out counterpoint as different lines on top of each other. I mean, we always have to go back to Bach for that in terms of the Ne plus ultra. But again, that's also about, again, Bach is always using that for communicate, for its purpose of communication, and about also particularly about points of tension and relaxing, and also, in fact, that's the whole arc of the Passions or the B minor Mass.
It's like a journey.
Yes.
Well, maybe a tough question.
Good.
So we see how, well, a single line, the Gregorian chant, is transformed. And yes, this is the whole purpose of our episode, the Rise of Polyphony, and how it is absorbed by the choirs. But Gregorian chant is still something very different, and with the time passing by, it still as this own single line with just one voice, and so it's a different kind of chant. So why does it fade out?
Well, yes, I think that's a very good question. I think often the answer is about taste, but it's also about where excitement seems to lie. Which is, and about always the sense about what seems to communicate in any one given era. But there are dangers inherent in all of these things. I think because also in terms of what notation makes possible is complexity. But I think it's possible to become too obsessed with complexity for its own sake. Is also sometimes it's you end up looking at the scores of a composer like Brian Ferneyhough, for example, and you go, I think it's more important to you how it looks on the page than it actually sounds. But because I think a lot of the answer is about what the idea of the composer becomes, and the idea of the composer as this author and this genius, and it's always about doing something impressive and complex, and the role of the choir leader conductor also as this kind of leader, and often the music, in so many ways, the history of music over the last few centuries has been about things which are about different types of prowess, Whether it's the speed of Paganini, or it's about the complexity of Messiaen, um, but also I think there are other, but there are always instincts that go in other directions too. There's been a very obvious kind of pull in a different direction in terms of, particularly in terms of 20th century complexity, to then moments of rejection of that, about when we're asking for something that speaks in a more direct voice and a more contemplative voice. The music of Arvo Pärt, for example, does that, and has struck chords with people widely across the globe. But interestingly, of course, that also Gregorian chant remains very much part of the fabric of our shared traditions. It's constantly referred to by musicians of all types. And so Benjamin Britten, one of the favorite Christmas works is Britten's ceremony carols, which begins with Hodie Christus Natus Est. But I think what he does in a piece like Curly River, which is which he calls a church parable. It's a sort of mini opera, which is based on a Japanese no theatre play, but he recreates it in a Western tradition, and he's again starts with plain chant. And the obvious point that Britten is making is this is the equivalent to a 1,000-year tradition in Japan. This is our tradition here, and even into something, the world of musical theatre, for example, would seem to be as far away as you might imagine from from what we're talking about. But Stephen Sondheim weaves the Dies Irae throughout his hit musical Sweeney Todd, again to make a point about his characters. So even if things sometimes seem to fade from from something which is really obviously part of our everyday musical texture, what you hear, it's also omnipresent.
I see. And maybe that's why at the beginning of the shift, nobody was very much aware of that shift to happen, because when you hear the Vespers of Monteverdi for the Beata Vergine, well, you have the beginning is like a Gregorian beginning, and then comes the melody, but it pertains to it, so it's like it's not that that different, because they are blended.
Yes, it's absolutely what's so fascinating is the beginning of that 1610 Vespers is that there is the chant, and then there is this blazing D major, and it's ostensibly the two contrasting worlds. It's the linear and the vertical. Immediately you're presented within seconds of each other. But as you say, it's also that one comes from the other, and because this is about how it's different presentations of how you use those tones.
Can we have nowadays? So Gregorian chant is still in use for the church as the church's own voice, as we said in the introduction, and it has to be so because the church wants to, but it lets some space for polyphony. How can we join the two kinds of music in a single spirituality? Can we, well, in a word, can we have a choir singing both, and both like perfectly, even if it's completely different now.
Well, I think it, but I think it is a fundamental question, which I think that at the heart of it is what you say. Well, what now? Knowing that we can't unknow what we know. If you see what I mean, it's so yeah, absolutely. Those, I mean, because those are. It's very interesting because it's about it's all sorts of questions are wrapped up in that, which is one is a kind of musical question, which is um we're always looking forward, always exploring musically, um, and that's the history of Western music, which is about about in so many ways asking about what if, um, um, but also it's the question about but but what for, which
Hmm.
is about what what is to what end. Um, and I think that's always the thing that I like choirs when I'm working with these who come back to, which is one spends quite a lot of time working on rhythm and harmony and pitching and but also why, what are you communicating, and what is the best way of communicating. And of course, obviously the history of that has been quite vexed, because obviously one of the fundamental questions that came with polyphony, which was about intelligibility, which is about the intelligibility of words, and obviously that was um, a significant question. Is, well, if also actually it becomes about putting all of these lines on top of each other, but we don't understand what this is about, what's the point?
Yeah.
um, Although I think the composers would say, but actually this we're using the whole panoply of tools that we have to communicate. But I think it's always coming back to what is the essential way of communicating of what you have to share.
Mm.
And that and I think that's always an important question for um, musical directors, for composers, for choirs, um, individual singers. Is that's what you have to return it to. Um, so, and that will be the kind of that will be the driving force.
Mm. And that's actually the about the question asked by Pope Pius V in the Council of Trent to the modern composers of this era, the Renaissance one, because their voices were blending all together, and liturgy is text. We need to understand. We need to have just a single word all together for maybe not for the entire piece, but just for certain parts of the liturgy. Because, for instance, at the word Jesus Christus, we need to make a reverence altogether. And if there is multiple Jesus Christus, when should we make that reverence? So that was the purpose, and yes, I think you answered
Yeah,
very well.
yes. Well, again, I mean, I think that's also a very well known kind of moment. I think also um, within sort of musical history as well, and I think it's seen as a kind of tension between expression, and the two, and also have two ideas of what expression are.
Mm.
Um, but it's not. But also that's I think those are questions I think we all continue to ask ourselves, actually, um, which is, is it reading, um, and also what, say, a contemporary composer like John Adams, is his book Hallelujah Junction, which is about his work, and is struggling with the same questions now, which is about how do you. Also, now we have even more possibilities, because it's we've got so many, we've got instruments, we've got voices, we've got electronics, we've got amplification. What do it about all? So there's a kind of we have an even greater proliferation of questions about how we approach vocal music, um, and it's just it also coming back to balancing an expressive urge with also what the rest of the world perceives. I think that's that's kind of one of the things which also is kind of very much the history of 20th century music, which is about about the sense of an individual an individual struggle, but as opposed to also what other a broad audience perceives, and that's what popular music is supposed to be popular. But that you're what I think that's but all one can do is keep on delving and asking the questions, but also not assuming that you can stay in any one place.
And that question is interesting because we'll have so many ways to make music, so many different instruments, voices, and opportunities to make new songs, new sounds, new even noises. But here with Gregorian and chant, we just need one voice, or altogether singing just one voice, and it happens to have a really appreciated expression.
Well, yes, I mean, obviously there is, again, now, particularly when that all of music history and all of the musical world is it's available there. And particularly now with through the internet and Spotify and all the rest of it, is that that's how how do you even decide what to listen to, and I think that then that brings you back. I think that brings everybody back to a point of going, well, perhaps at some point it's worth just clearing things out a bit, and perhaps a kind of new appreciation of simplicity, and focus, and clarity, and lack of clutter and noise. So that's perhaps also opens up a new role, which seems fairly sort of obvious in lots of ways, but is also the kind of where we sit with a kind of the sense of a kind of relation to traditions now, and what that means for us. Also having something which has a clearly, I was talking about the musical line, but also the sense of a historical line.
For sure. And probably we are better singers if we sing all the different periods, if we can sing or even just know what happened from the beginning to our days, because we need to understand what we are doing, not just in a technical sense, or in a musical or expressive way, but also in a very rooted history that we have. That we are child of a world. We're not made of nothing.
Yeah, yes, I very much like that. Yeah, we're children of the world. That's absolutely true. And I think it's also absolutely true that it's I think the broader one's knowledge, the kind of more it actually informs what one does, and so because there's lots of different types of singing traditions now. I'm just what's kind of so fascinating about doing the work that I'm doing currently with County of Song, working with choirs across the county of Lancashire, and so there's everything from male voice choirs to gospel choirs. There's it's the whole world of a world of song out there. But yes, there are connections through, and I think it's helpful to understand that. I think particularly, again, for anyone writing music, is also, I think we're very much aware of whose shoulders we're standing on, and that also that sometimes that can feel rather daunting. But also it is a support as well. But I think I think it's quite interesting within, particularly where we sit here we are in England and in the United Kingdom, and where I think we have quite a fraught relationship to the idea of traditions, our own traditions. We're quite embarrassed about our song traditions, or our cultural traditions. It's like things like Morris dancing, for example. It's a kind of common joke, and in a way that, say, in Estonia, not at all, or Estonia or Finland, having a shared song history. And I think a lot of that, and I think a lot of the reason for actually England in particular, is our own fraught relationship to kind of our own cultural traditions, is because of the Cultural Revolution. It's the industrial revolution, not Chinese Cultural Revolution. So it's particularly that shift from that very early shift, kind of historically compared to the rest of the world, into an urban culture, had also, I think, gives us a sort of very sort of odd relationship. So it's about now how we come to thinking about cultural tradition, I think, and particularly in the current cultural and political context, I think is quite fascinating.
Thank you very much. Well, actually, we will meet again for a sharing experience with our Gregorian choir and polyphony.
Yes, absolutely. Again, looking forward to also sharing that with others. And I think for me, it's been a very interesting experience to see and hear this, and also in the context of what's happening with vocal music across the county. But I find it fascinating about how many things also seem to exist in different pockets, even with say a place like Preston, is that so where we're sitting now, we're so close to St Walburge, and also there's a choir. I know there's a choir that meets in this building, and you go. Again, it's about, in a way, repairing some of those threads of how we all connect, back to what you said about, us all being children of this world and our shared traditions.
Thank you very much. Is there anything you want to add for our listeners?
No, I think we've ranged very
We've talked a lot.
extraordinary broadly, but I think that is the point as well. That also coming back to things which, and to points which now seem in many ways inconceivably ancient for many people. Hildegard of Bingen, Perotin, but also this is where the world that we know is born in so many ways.
For sure. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.